The nose is in fact, of course, the center of the face, and often it's dealt with poorly by artists because it's something that seems to be elusive to understanding exactly how it is so important. Most artists tend to feature or focus on the eyes and on the mouth, which are very expressive. The nose really doesn't have much expression. So let's have a look at the anatomy of the nose and see how actually it is quite important, but at the same time, it's just a matter of how you approach it. If we look at the anatomy of the nose and you think about taking into account where it is on the face, in the middle of the face, we have an area between the eyes which is defined by the orbits of the eye. So you have the superior medial margin of the orbit, the inferior medial margin of the orbit. You have the area of the nasal bone which finishes approximately where you would have the eyes centered. And often that's where the nasal bone finishes and where the cartilage begins. The cartilaginous part of the nose is important to consider because it defines the real look of the person, the proportions of the person, and whether they look more youthful or they have an older look about them. The middle one part of the face, which is defined in the measurements we've been using for the portrait, defined by the space between the eyebrow and the underplane of nose, that particular 1/3 of the face, if it is shorter than the upper 1/3 and the lower 1/3 of the face, can make the person look a lot younger, a lot more youthful. If it is elongated and it's longer than the top 1/3 and the bottom 1/3 of the face, it can make the person look older. In the case of our model, we had reasonably close to equal 1/3 of the face. But if you don't take into account the wedge shape that exists between, say, the eyebrow and where the nasal bone ends and where the cartilage begins, if you don't take into account that that particular area of the face is turning away from the light and is thrown somewhat into shadow, and then you just go straight down to the underplane of the nose, and you make the nose start a little bit higher at the eyebrow and finish right on the underplane of the nose will look a lot longer and it won't approximate the proportions of your subject's face. So when you're drawing the nose, it's important that you take into account that particular wedge shape, which is just where the bony area of the nasal bone finishes, and the other wedge shape, if you flip that 180 degrees, the other wedge shape, which is in fact the underplane of the nose. So the nose is made up of, if you want to break it down, in a box-like shape, and I'm taking the angle slightly to mimic what our model was earlier in the portrait. So you take it in a box-like shape, and you put at the end of the box shape, imagine a ball of cartilage. So imagine a sphere with two smaller spheres pressed into the bigger sphere. So if you take that into account, as that is what the nose essentially is, the ball shapes represent the cartilaginous ball of the nose and the ala cartilage on the side. The varying shape that differs from person to person is how you treat that ball, whether you make it more angular or slightly rounder. If I was to draw this and define it a little bit stronger, that would be the shape there. If you take into account that that wedge shape up there is mimicked 180 degrees by a wedge shape up down here, and you also throw that into shadow, that straight away means that the nose has been reduced in length down to what it should be according to the proportions of the model. More importantly is how you look at the shape of the nose. We all know that a sphere, when a light is thrown, a unidirectional light is thrown on a sphere, a shadow is created. Not only to cast shadow, but also the shadow on the sphere itself. Imagine that same occurrence happening with the nose. Then you can just look at putting in the actual shape of the nostrils, which are defined as not two rather large circles, but in fact just like little curves, because that's the direction of the shadows that you're throwing. And then you can consider that this particular shape is therefore the underplane of the nose. So essentially, if then you want to define the shape of the nose, if there's a slight variation and the nose is not perfectly straight, you can indicate that by the line of the nose. If the unidirectional light across the nose is in that direction, as following from our portrait demonstration, you would expect there to be a slight shadow thrown from the larger sphere onto the smaller sphere on the far side, and there'd be a slight shadow and slight change of direction where the structure goes from a block-like shape into the cartilaginous ball-like shape. So if I was then to look at how the nose is created from adjusting the shape, it would be more like, here would be the ala cartilage. There's the nostril underneath. Here's the shape of the nose as it comes around. You can see here's the nostril here on this side. So it can be quite a simple form if broken down into this sort of description. And if you approach the nose every time by a simple breakdown of shapes like this, then it's a lot easier to handle the different shapes. So if it happens to be that there's a more angular shape to the nose, you can define that. There might be a more bulbous shape of the nose, you could define that. This part of the nose might be broader, you can define that. You can make the changes accordingly, but the basic shape of the nose, if you can take into account, is essentially a larger ball, a larger sphere shape with two smaller spheres pressed into the side. It'll make your drawing of a nose a lot simpler.